Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's so good to hear so many voices in this space. Good evening. My name is Shannon Sinova, and I am the manager of public programs here at the Hammer Museum. We're deeply grateful to all of our Hammer members and supporters, but we are especially appreciative that we're joined tonight by Hammer Board of Advisors member Susan Bay Nimoy, whose support makes programs like this possible. And it's a particular honor to have Susan here for our reading since we are currently in the Bay Nimoy studio. Thank you, Susan. Tonight's program, tonight's program is part of our long-standing literary series called Some Favorite Writers, which is an ongoing collaboration between the Hammer and the UCLA Department of English. And it's curated by the wonderful novelist and UCLA professor of English, Mona Simpson. Yay. Mona is the best-selling author of Anywhere But Here, The Lost Father, A Regular Guy, Off Keck Road, My Hollywood, Casebook, and Commitment. And as of 2020, she is also the publisher of the Paris Review. Tonight, Mona has brought us author Katie Kitamura, whose most recent novel, Audition, was shortlisted for the 2025 Booker Prize. I will let Mona say more about Katie, but I have to share that I could not put Audition down, and I finished it in a single sitting. It is a riveting read, and I cannot recommend it enough, and we have copies available in the back of the room. With that, please join me in welcoming to the stage Mona Simpson.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction, Shannon, and thank you, Susan. We enjoy this space so often, and it's such a pleasure to have readings here. I'm going to keep my introduction of Katie Kitamura short because I know of 3 classes and at least 2 book groups who all are eager to join in the conversation. That's rare. We haven't really had that circumstance where that many people have come having already read the book. This book, Audition, is the 5th of your novels, and it's you've also written 2 books of nonfiction. But this book, Audition, is the finalist for the Booker Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award. And like her last novel, Intimacies, and her 2017 novel, A Separation, it was an end-of-the-year book of multiple, almost every newspaper and every magazine. There was unanimity, and these are people who agree on nothing, but they agree on Katie. Just for fun, I picked quotes from 3 different writers, very different writers, who all were lauding Katie Kitamura. Rachel Kushner, our LA Rachel Kushner says, Katie Kitamura is a dizzyingly skilled writer whose fictions always seem to manage 2 contradictory effects, a supple, seductive surface under which the chaos of minds and repressed realities roil. She's an original, building an entire métier of her own. Lauren Groff says, Katie Kitamura is one of our most brilliant writers, saying far more in her silences, blank spaces, and disruptions than most novelists can say in 100,000 words. Audition is eerie, a book so cold it feels hot. It hooked into my mind like a burr. And Hernan Diaz, I think, has my favorite quote, which is, he says, you've never read anything like this gorgeously disquieting book. Audition challenges our preconceptions about love, art, and selfhood, and magnificently our very idea of how a novel should unfold. If all the world's a stage, Kitamura reminds us that we never stop auditioning for our parts. Katie Kitamura is a master of structure, mystery, and form. Let's hear her read. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mona and Shannon, for that incredibly generous introduction, and thank you to all of you for being here. It's wonderful to be in this extraordinary, beautiful museum, and it's very nice to be in LA on a rainy day. I feel like I've experienced something special. This novel is about a actress, a woman who's very much in the middle of her life. She's in rehearsals for a new play. She's happily married. And her life is upended when a young man approaches her and tells her that he believes that he is her son. And from that point, two possible narratives unfold in the book. And I first had the kind of idea for the book when I read a headline, I think in the New York Times, that said, "A stranger told me he was my son." And I never clicked on the link, and I never read this article because, in part, I already knew I wanted to write a book about that headline, and because I had the sense that the article would probably resolve the mystery of that headline. There'd be some kind of narrative explanation for that mysterious tension between stranger and son. Perhaps the person who'd written the article had put a child into adoption, or perhaps there was some other perfectly logical explanation. And I was much more tantalized by the illogical nature of that proposition. But I couldn't quite see my way into the book. I couldn't quite see my way past the headline, and I put it aside, and I wrote a very different book, which was set at a war crimes tribunal. And then as I was finishing up that book, I went for a walk with a dear friend of mine who's a wonderful poet, and who has a son who is quite a bit older than my own children, who at that time was in his mid-20s. And I told her about the headline, and I said, I feel that there's a novel there, but I can't quite work out what that novel is. And she said, tell me the headline again. And I said, "A stranger told me he was my son." And she said, "But that's just a description of parenthood." Every time, she said, "Every time my son comes home from college, it's like a stranger has walked into the apartment." And when she said that, I suddenly thought, oh, that's the novel that I want to write. I want to write about how there are certain universal experiences of parenthood, of marriage, maybe of trying to make work or trying to make art, that contain within them oppositional aspects, things that don't feel like they can be neatly reconciled. And I wanted to write a book that was about that contradiction. I think the only other thing I will say is that it's a book that's very, very open to interpretation, and it's been deliberately written that way. It's a book that I always thought of as being one that was made hand in hand with the reader. So in that sense, it's quite a demanding book. I think it asks a lot of the reader. I can't open this, sorry. There we go. The section that I'm going to read, you don't need to know any of that, I hope. It's a standalone section, but it is a passage that is about authorial intention and about interpretation. So what do you need to know? Xavier is the name of the young man. The actress the narrator is on her way to rehearsal, and the director of the play is called Anne. Xavier asked if I'd been able to immerse myself in my new part, if that process had taken place, and I looked up at him, startled out of my thoughts. He was gazing at me with a placid expression, not in the least as if he were asking a sensitive question. And yet, he had touched upon something that was in fact a vulnerability. He had found, with unerring intuition, something that was now beginning to trouble me. I wondered how innocent the question was, if Anne had said something to him, if she could also tell that things were not progressing as they should. Perhaps that was even the reason why he had been waiting at the corner, outside the cafe, where I always picked up a coffee on my way into rehearsal. Perhaps all this time it was Anne who had sent him. It would have been fair for her to be concerned. We were 3 weeks into rehearsal, and I'd had an unusually long time to prepare, and yet I still felt myself too much to be playing a part. I couldn't seem to locate the center of the role. That wasn't necessarily unusual. In the past, there had been plenty of parts that had continued to elude me, even as the work as a whole improved, whether through my own failing, or failing in the writing, or the direction, or something else altogether. The alchemy was particular, and the truth was that there were many occasions when it went awry, or did not cohere. I'd come to see it as something of a crapshoot. You never knew if this would be the one, when everything would come together, or if it would fall by the wayside, another disposable performance, the detritus of a soon-to-be-forgotten artistic endeavor. But in the case of this part, this production, I had every reason to hope for the best. Not only was I working with Anne, but the play had been written by a playwright I had long admired. She was a young writer, exceptionally brilliant. I had seen an early production of hers at a small theater downtown that seated no more than 80 people. The theater was half empty the night I went, but even in a half-empty theater with a cast of unknowns, I knew that she was an extraordinary talent. Tension grew out of every scene, scenes in which nothing took place, and people said very little, and yet the pressure grew and grew, so that by the end of the play, I realized I'd been in a sickening state of unease for some time, and when I emerged from the theater, I was simultaneously invigorated and physically exhausted, every nerve in my body still standing on end. Of course, I immediately called my agent and asked her to arrange a meeting, and not too long after that, I spoke to Anne, who had also seen the young playwright's work and been similarly impressed. However, everyone had been by then, so it was by no means assured that we would have the opportunity to work with her, much less that she would make a new piece with us. But as it turned out, after nearly 2 years of expressions of intent and little more, she suddenly called me and said she had something. When she sent me the play, I knew from the first page that this was the part for me, the one that came along only very rarely, and that if I was patient and careful, it could form the basis of the best work I had ever done. But then, after the first table read, and after the early rehearsals and the later rehearsals, and even as Anne and the playwright herself extolled the virtues of my interpretation, even as the pieces began to fall into place, and the shape of the performances began to emerge, and even as I began to see in the not-too-distant future the point at which the emergence would cease, and the structure of the work began to ossify, so that although some movement would remain possible, its essential parameters would be set. Even then, I had the sense that I was still too much clinging to the shore. The part, the world of it, continued to elude me, and I knew that the window of opportunity was closing, that I had to make some shift within myself, or the role would slip away. I'd been silent for some time, and now I said, "There's only 1 more week of rehearsal, and then we go into tech." Anne said that you're already excellent. "I'm not where I need to be," I responded. "I'm waiting for something to happen, and time is running out." I moved my head uneasily. I didn't know why I was telling Xavier this. "There's always a chance that the breakthrough takes place later," I said, "but I'm starting to fear I won't get there." He nodded sympathetically, as if he understood what I was saying, although that seemed unlikely. I hardly knew what I was saying myself. "It's not through any fault of Anne's," I added, "and the play itself is wonderful. It's me." "But what if you are actually good? Does it matter how you feel?" "Of course it matters," I said quickly. But even as I spoke, I found myself uncertain. Did it matter? It mattered in the sense that the work was what counted, not the activity that surrounded it, the energy that collected or dissipated upon its reception. But I didn't know how to separate the work from its effect. I recalled a recent film centered on a performance that had seemed to me so extraordinary it recast everything I knew about the actor, whom I had previously found rather uninteresting despite his storied career and reputation. As he had gotten older, there was a palpable laziness to his work, the sense that he could no longer be bothered to rouse himself to his former heights. He was always playing some previous version of himself, the version that had won the acclaim and sealed the reputation. But in this film, in Salvation, he had produced a performance of rare depth and complexity, recalling the promise he showed at the very start of his career, when he still seemed moved by ambition and curiosity. He played each scene with painful caution, reaching out to touch a table, a counter, as if seeking to be grounded. I could feel the character's turmoil in almost every instant on screen. He would look down and then up again, and there would be an expression of such confusion on his face that it was not too much to say that my heart broke as I watched him. I had to admit that I'd been wrong. He was in fact an actor of remarkable subtlety and commitment, and I subsequently agreed to work with him. But soon after we arrived on set, to my surprise, I found that he was as vacuous and vain as I had previously thought, and as we began to rehearse, I felt a jolt of distress. He seemed to have little sense of the scene, and he knew none of his lines. He kept tipping his head down into the script and mouthing the words to himself, for all the world as if he had never so much as seen them in his life. I felt frustration and even anger. It was hard not to take it as a sign of disrespect. After all, he He was wasting my time and the time of everyone on set. He was even wasting his own time, of which, I remember thinking maliciously, he did not have a great deal remaining. Perhaps sensing my exasperation, the director pulled me aside and said that the actor was having trouble memorizing his lines and was unlikely to recall any of them, and that I should be prepared for this. I shouldn't expect matters to improve. I looked at him in confusion, and he explained that he had spoken to Stan, the director of Salvation. "I should have told you earlier," he said, "but the truth is, I only just found out. He can't remember his lines. He turned up on the set of Salvation every day without knowing any of them." I gave a short laugh of disbelief, and the director raised his hand as if to stop me. At first, Stan thought it was simply lack of focus and preparation, but quite soon he realized that it was beyond his control. He really couldn't retain the words for even the minute between looking at the script and delivering them from inside the scene. So they stuck notes with the lines on every surface of the set and muddled through. "Do you remember the scene in the kitchen when he's running his hands across the counter? That's him, looking for his note. Same in the bathroom scene." I stared at the director in disbelief. "As it turned out," he continued wryly, "the result was genuinely remarkable, and it was on that basis that I cast him in this movie, the one we're now making, or trying to, at least. It was only later that I discovered the source of the performance's strength, which is the fact that it is no performance at all. That confusion that you see on screen is completely real. You're looking at a man lost, with no sense of what the story is. Trapped inside the scene, with the camera staring at him, you're watching a man who is seeing his life and his career drift away." "But why didn't Stan tell you?" I asked. "It works for that, I admit." And here I stopped and nodded to myself. "I admit it works very well for that film. But for this—" "I know," the director said. "When Stan told me, I was furious. Why didn't you warn me?" I asked. Stan simply said that he would have felt as if he were betraying the actor. For such a story to become public, for such a story even to circulate within the industry would be fatal. It wasn't that he felt especially loyal to the actor. He was more than happy to complain about his vanity and his bullheadedness. It was in this one regard that he felt a kind of fidelity. He had even attempted to hide the degree of the actor's impairment from the crew. He had not said that the actor was suffering from dementia, but instead claimed that he had refused to learn his lines, that he was lazy, stupid, words of abuse that were in fact designed to protect the actor, to prevent the others from guessing the terrible truth. "You see," the director said, "in his way, Stan loved him." "Yes," I said, "or perhaps it was the performance he loved and the process of extracting it. On some level, what Stan had done was ruthless and unconscionable. He must have known that he had crossed a moral line, and I couldn't help but feel that it was the secret of that transgression, not the aging actor, not even the reputation of the film, that Stan was so eager to protect." In any case, our film had not replicated the success of Salvation, although the actor continued to muddle through and work came to him as frequently as before. Probably even now he was somewhere on set, wandering through a scene. At the time, I remember being shocked and also disillusioned by the disclosure. It changed the way I saw the performance. After my conversation with the director, I went back and rewatched the film, and all I could see was a man with incipient dementia, lost on screen, searching restlessly for his lines, for the words he knew he was meant to be saying. But now, as Xavier walked alongside me, it occurred to me that the performance did remain. That is to say, the performance I had experienced the first and even second time I watched the film remained extant, and I thought that it was true that a performance existed in the space between the work and the audience, that it existed and was made in that space of interpretation. But then I also thought that if ever an actor had lost sight of the shore, then it was this one. He had stumbled deep into the interior, and I wonder if he worried that he would never find his way out, if the world of fiction had lost its protective powers, the line between reality and invention undone. The confusion and the vulnerability that I had seen on screen was real enough. And I thought again of the panic in the actor's eyes, which was entirely authentic, when he stood in the middle of the set, when he looked at the other actors, the director, for his scrap of paper. In that moment, everything must have been terribly, terrifyingly real. Because, of course, there was another element to the performance Salvation, which was death. And although the actor was only in his 60s, as soon as I heard the story of the notes on the counter, in the forgotten lines. As soon as I heard this, I was able to envision his death. I was able to imagine the parabolic arc of his decline. I understood that eventually his mind would disintegrate to the point that his memory of the world and of himself will be lost, and with it, everything that formed his being. It was death. That was what we had responded to when we watched him wading through those scenes on screen, even if we hadn't understood it. The film was a portrait of a man in the process of surrender. I no longer knew how I felt about Salvation, a work I previously enjoyed in such a pure and naive way that innocence was gone. I understood all too well what I was seeing. And I wondered also if that wasn't the point of a performance, that it preserved our innocence, that it allowed us to live with the hypocrisies of our desire. Because in fact, we don't want to see the thing itself on a screen or on a stage. We don't want to see actual pain or suffering or death, but its representation. Our awareness of the performance is what allows us to enjoy the emotion, to creep close to it and breathe in its atmosphere. Performance allows this dangerous proximity. And without it, Salvation was only a snuff film. And so I said to Xavier that it did matter. Yes, it did. Without intentionality, there was no agency, no control. The work was happening to you, an impossible inversion. Ah, he said lightly, and he took a sip of coffee. We had arrived at our destination. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for that. What an astonishing piece of writing.
Thank you.
It's funny. That's such a shimmering section. It's just magnificent. Can you talk a little bit about, for the few people in the room who probably haven't read the book, talk a little bit about the enclosure of the voice and the narrator's voice in this novel. And she does also comment. This is not the only work of art she comments on. She also comments on the play itself and her struggles with that, and the playwright's work. So, and then there's a later play in the book.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. I mean, I've written now 3 novels that have used this particular first-person voice. They're all unnamed female narrators. They're all characters who are wrapped up in the work of interpretation in some way. In one of the novels, the character is a translator. In another, she's a simultaneous interpreter. And then in this one, she's an actor. And they're all, I think, most importantly, they're characters who speak the words of other people. There's very little backstory. I don't really do backstory. I don't know backstory in my head either. Though often people ask me if I know the names of the characters or I know, what their favorite color was when they were 8. And I don't know any of that information, but what I do know quite intimately and precisely is how they react to a situation in real time. And so that's very much always what I'm trying to capture and explore in the voice, I think, is I'm trying to execute this kind of gamble that even if I withhold a character's name, maybe even their nationality, their background, if I plunge the reader deep enough into their point of view so that they are seeing the world through the eyes of the character, will that create enough of a sense of intimacy that they will feel close to the reader, to the character for the duration of the novel? So that's really has always been my ambition with the voice, is to capture the kind of movement of a mind. So one of the wonderful lies of first person is that characters know exactly how to tell the story and that they always speak in beautiful, complete sentences and using perfect metaphors. I think some people actually do speak and think like that, but I certainly don't. So I think in my first person, I'm much more trying to depict the way a mind of somebody who doesn't know how to tell this story, who maybe doesn't even know what the story is, how that person's mind might work.
You're also very interested, you're a formalist, really. You're very interested in forms. And what comes to you first, the the sort of the form or the structure of a novel, or it seems the situation is very, very relevant to the character in your books, more than I would say
Yes.
in most books.
Yeah, I think it's almost always for me an ethical dilemma of some kind. In the case of this novel, it was really the question of what happens when a stranger comes to you with an impossible demand, and what are your responsibilities to that stranger. With my previous book, it was really, which is about a simultaneous interpreter who's working at a war crimes tribunal, and who is witness and who has a kind of intimacy with a person who has perpetrated genocide. In that case, it was really this question of complicity and the kind of duality of intimacy, the costs of intimacy, and also the question of what it means to witness something. And
tie that in with a separation a little bit too.
And then a separation was really, in a way, the one that I think, I mean, with each of these, I feel like I started with a proposition and then drifted quite far away from it. But in a separation, it's really the novel where I think it does hew quite closely to that initial question. That novel is about a woman who is separated from her husband. Her husband has said, please don't tell anybody for the time being. Promise me that. She makes this promise to him. He subsequently disappears and then is found dead. And then she has to decide whether or not she will honor this promise that she has kept to somebody who she thinks she no longer loves. And that is definitely was the starting point for that novel. So with all of them, I think it really is a question of ethics in some way. And then the structure and everything else follows.
And then the story within a story you've just read us is also about a kind of ethics in making art. What do you consider? Do you struggle with any ethical questions in making fiction? I know I do. There are ethical questions to what we do.
A lot. I really do. And I've thought about it. I suppose one example of how I've tried to think about it is actually, again, in my previous novel, which was I had a lot of hesitation about how to represent atrocity, and in particular how to represent the experience of somebody who had survived atrocity, because of course that's very far from my own experience. And the question of who has the right to tell what story was very alive to me as I was writing that book. And the only way I could think my way through that was to put that question directly on the page in some way, and to have that be the animating question of that particular scene. So in that novel, when there is a scene when one of the survivors of this civil war is testifying in the court, I think I put all of my questions and concerns directly into the character of the interpreter, who asks what it means for her to speak, because when you interpret in a court, you use the first person of the person you're interpreting for. And she asks, what does it mean for me to speak this I? Is this I big enough for both myself and for the person I'm interpreting? And I think that's a question every novelist thinks about, is the voice I'm using capacious enough to contain both myself and this other experience that I'm purporting to represent?
Right. I like that answer. Can you talk about what you're thinking of doing next?
I am in an unusual position of trying to write possibly three things at the same time,
that's exciting.
which I never do. I remember hearing that Lauren Groff works on up to 3 novels at a time, and she just cycles through them, and she wakes up in the morning and decides which one is speaking to her most urgently, and that's the one she works on, which is extraordinary to me. I'm generally somebody who much more works kind of on one project in depth, but I'm finishing up a novel that is set in Italy and is about female friendship in middle age. And then I'm hoping to start a new novel imminently that is about post-war Japanese film.
And do you like the idea of doing 2 at once? Do you think that'll be because I've heard that from a lot of writers. Alice McDermott also writes. She starts two, and then she says, as time goes on, one sort of gets ahead of the other.
Yeah, Tess Gunty says that she always has like the book she's meant to be writing, and then the secret book, and then the secret book is usually the book that ends up...
The book that ends up finishing
the book
first.
That I think that's what happened with The Rabbit Hutch, is that was her secret project, and then it, of course, ended up winning the National Book Award. But I'm really enjoying... I think one thing that I'm very conscious of is trying to change... I don't know how you feel... trying to change my process with each book so that it isn't the same way of writing every single time. And so...
How do you do that to shake things up? Do you do it?
Well,
are there any sort of logistical things you do differently?
I mean, I think a lot of it is logistics, because it's about practice in some way. So for example, with my previous novel, which is called Intimacies, I didn't do an MFA. I am married to another writer who's my first reader, but in general, we share our drafts when they're completely finished. And so I'm not a person.
You share your first drafts or your later drafts?
We share quite finished drafts, so not first drafts. So drafts.
Is there anyone you show before you show your husband? Interesting.
No. In general, I'm very retentive. And I hold on to things for a very long time. So with Intimacies, I because I teach on an MFA program, and it is very inspiring to me that people come in with work that they've written the week before, and they're incredibly vulnerable and open, and they share it with a room full of people they know, but still 12 other people. So I thought I'm gonna do that, and I gave Intimacies to my editors before it was done, and went through a very extended editing process with them, in part because I was interested to see what it would be like to write with a lot of input, because something that I felt at that stage was that by the time I was sharing my books, the problems had ossified in some way. They were really in the bones of the. They were baked into the book. It was. However skilled an editor, it was too hard to kind of recalibrate. So I wanted to...
And how did you find that?
Very stressful. Very stressful and very collaborative.
Did you do it again for this book?
No.
Which is telling.
No, which is maybe telling. No, I didn't. With this book, in part because it has this conceit where it changes realities in the middle.
Right in the middle.
Right in the middle. And it's... I really thought I need to share it when I'm pretty sure it's working, because I thought if I didn't, it would be very easy. I don't want to say easy, and I have such brilliant editors, but I could see the likelihood of somebody saying, just don't do this.
Yeah, and you don't want to hear that.
And you don't want to hear that.
At least you want it to be as good as it can be.
Yeah, so in the case of this book, this was then the complete opposite of Intimacies. I really edited it a lot before I showed it to anybody, and then it didn't change that much in edits.
What's it like being married to a writer?
It's great. I love it. I really love it. I mean, one of the great things is there's a kind of level of quality control in the household. So I'll just say, please don't let me embarrass myself.
Or the family.
Or the family, yeah. But I think it's also, it's very moving to see, and I think it would be the case with anybody in any field maybe. But, we don't talk about what we're working on either. So I have no idea what my husband is writing and has been writing for the last 2 years.
Wow.
Yeah. And then he shows me a complete draft of this extraordinary novel, and it's really thrilling because, for the interceding 3 years, I've been grateful to him and appreciating him for picking up the kids or cooking dinner or emptying the dishwasher, and then suddenly I can say, oh, you're completely brilliant as well. And that's really, really a joy. Yeah.
That's so nice.
Yeah.
One more question about the structure of this book. Did you look to other... Did it come to you just naturally, or did you think it came out of your reading at all? Because it strikes me that it reminded me, I guess, of Portrait of a Lady. It reminded me of To the Lighthouse, because there are a number of novels that are sort of have these formal containers right at the middle.
That's so, I did part of my PhD on Henry James, and I love Portrait of a Lady, and it's a novel that I reread pretty regularly as well. And I think because I have never consciously thought of that as a reference, but you're completely right.
You said earlier to the students that you don't necessarily write every day, but you read every day.
I do read every day. I do. I read every day like it's my job, and it's and I try to read I try to order my readings so that I read a contemporary novel and then a novel written between, say, post-war to now, and then something written kind of pre-1900s.
So you do 1, 2, 3? I mean, you do...
I try to cycle through, but then I usually...
that's interesting.
Yeah, but then I usually end up having to read something for something else. But I mean, in terms of the structure, a lot of my references were actually films. Vertigo was a big reference. Lost Highway was a big reference. And then in terms of thematically and in terms of tone, The Servant by Joseph Losey was a huge reference. I remember I was actually at a residency in Switzerland, which is where most of my writing gets done, is somehow there needs to be an ocean between me and my children for me to get any writing done. And I had the idea for the structure, and then I went and I watched The Servant, and then I probably wrote about half the book.
Oh, wow.
In the following couple of weeks.
And how long do you go for when you go for a residency?
That one was 2 weeks long.
But that can be an intense 2 weeks.
It can. It's that unbroken immersion. It's that thing of waking up and writing immediately, and then going and writing through the day, going to bed, and then having your brain work on it in the night, and then waking up again.
There's something so special about that. And in a way, if you're there longer, it becomes like life anyway.
And then you're ready to go.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Well, I could talk all night, but I know we have a lot of questions from this audience, especially this audience. But we actually do tape these sessions. So if you don't mind raising your hand, someone will come to you with a microphone so we can record you properly.
You had said at the beginning that you wanted this to be up to interpretation from your readers, that you weren't sort of forcing that on them. And so I'm curious, in reviews, conversations with others, settings like this, has anybody come up with, I don't know, an interpretation or something like an interpretation, thought simultaneously, didn't see that one coming, and yep, that might be right?
Yes, often. And there were, I've now blocked it. It must have been traumatic. Somebody recently said, had an interpretation I hadn't heard before, and I thought, that's completely correct. I mean, the one that I had not intended, but that I can completely understand, is actually to do with the excerpt I read. A lot of people have interpreted the character as having dementia in some form, which is why in the second half she seems to have these kind of gaps in her memory, and was not what I intended. But I also think, I mean, I as I said, I went to graduate school for English literature, and I spent all my time freely interpreting the texts of authors who were dead, and so they couldn't tell me I was wrong. And I think I did have this pretty strong sense that, regardless of what the author thought, there are things the texts were doing. And I still think that's true to a certain extent. And I hope that's true. I mean, one of my absolute favorite lines from any novel is from this Hervé Letellier novel, The Anomaly, which has as one of the characters this kind of mid-list, mid-career, very mid writer, and he says, and writing has ruined his marriage. He's earned no money. His life has stalled, and he says to himself, why does he continue to write? And he says it's because if he could write one sentence that was more intelligent than he was, that miracle would be enough to make a writer of him. And I think that's so much what almost every writer is dreaming of, is that you can make something that will have meanings beyond the ones that you've intended, that there's enough kind of air circulating that it can do something that's outside your control. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my question is similar to the first one. You said that the reality of the second part is up for interpretation, but doesn't the ending, the 13th chapter, seem to push the answer that the first part is the real one by revealing that the narrator, Tomas, and Xavier were all playing roles, and that the narrator and Xavier do not have the real history needed to sustain them? And I like that, by the way, because I found it very cathartic, the ending being an explanation after 6 chapters of their attempted immersement and increasing discrepancies. So did you intend for the ending to be read like a twist, like an explanation for all the strange behaviors that had been going on, the impossible scene that segues between part 1 and 2? Or did you want the truth to be more open-ended?
Thank you so much for that question. It's really interesting that you say that, because nobody has brought that up, and it's absolutely the one, not the one, I'm sure there are many moments in the novel, but it is the moment in the novel that is quite decisive, I think, in its interpretation. There's, at the end of part 1, the director claps her hands, and that kind of signals the start of the play, in a way. And then in the end of the section that you just mentioned, the narrator, I think, claps her hands, and that signals the end of this play. And you kind of, they land themselves decisively into a kind of reality that aligns with the first half of the book. I think the only thing that, I think the reason why I wrote the very scene that follows, which is when the character of Xavier returns to the household, and it's again slightly ambiguous, the nature of his relationship with them, and you can again read that scene either as a son returning to see his parents, or as a stranger returning to see these people he's had this uncomfortable relationship with. And then he gives them a play, and then that's meant to signal a possible, to destabilize the first half again, because there's this possibility that the play he's written is what we've just seen performed. Thank you. Thanks for that question.
Yeah. So I strongly believe that a work of art, and specifically a work of literature, we can enjoy it as a standalone work without necessarily knowing anything about the author biographically or their influences or anything like that. However, I must admit, Katie, that when I read Audition, I completely geeked out and listened to every podcast you did and every interview. And what fascinated me was that we share a lot of common interest. In fact, I came across your work through, you were moderating an interview with Apichapong Wirasetakul.
Yes.
Yes. And I love his work. He was a guest here recently. And then, of course, Lost Highway, David Lynch, and The Servant is a big one. So my question, in fact, has to do with The Servant, because watching The Servant, the power dynamic between the characters and the slippages in their subjective point of view have a lot to do and are expressed very clearly through architecture. And having a background in architecture, I'm fascinated in how the house functions, especially in the second half of your book. So I'm just curious, how, I guess, you approach, space in your stories. Do you actually sketch out a floor plan? Do you have it mapped out? Is it based on somewhere you've been or maybe you've lived? I'm very curious about that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I actually, so I did this kind of funny multidisciplinary PhD, but one of the institutions involved was the Architectural Association in London. So when I was a graduate student, and that was definitely the hippest of all the institutions that were involved in my PhD program. So I spent all my time hanging out at the AA pretending I knew something about architecture when all I knew about all I was trying to know about was literature. But architecture is really, really important to me in terms of how I think about fiction, how I think about scenes, and how I think about novels in general. I mean, I have a kind of a craft lecture that I've given a few times that is about architecture and fiction in particular. And I think, of course, it's about built environments. I think about that a lot, and about how architectural spaces organize our behavior and create certain kinds of identities and that we change according to the spaces we're in, and that how so many physical built environments are expressions of institutional power and social structures and social hierarchies. But on a much more kind of more basic level, when I'm writing a scene, I'm always trying to figure out where the characters are in relation to each other. And there's a wonderful quote from the theater director Declan Donnellan where he says, the meaning of a text isn't in the words, it's in the space between the actors as they say the words. And I really think about that a lot. I always know where the actors, not the actors, characters are in relation to each other every time I write a scene. And I do know the architecture. I know the layout of all the spaces. I think most writers must know the layout of their spaces. Yeah.
Next question.
Hi, I'm curious. I'm over here, all the way over to your right. That's okay. I'm just curious about the different level of confidence I think the narrator has from how actors are usually portrayed. They're usually portrayed, I think, as gaining their confidence or judging their performances based on external factors. And this narrator is quite self-reliant. I mean, and the narrator also interrogates that throughout the book, including in the passage you read. And then based on what you just said about your process, it seems like you're quite self-reliant on judging your work and when it's ready and when it's working. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what are those kind of tipping points where you feel things moving in the right direction, or maybe where you need to pivot?
It's such a great question. I do think there's something slightly magical that happens when you're working on a book. I hope I don't. I'm going to sound very, very like woo-woo. I'm worried, but there is a moment when suddenly everything seems to fall into place in a weird way, and the references just seem to be there, and the breakthroughs happen in a rhythm. Does that seem? I'm looking at you. Does that like where suddenly everything seems to feed into the world that you're trying to build, and that feels to me that's the only moment when I feel that it is definitely moving in the right direction. I mean, I don't share my work very much, but that's not out of confidence. That's out of the opposite, I think. And I have very little sense of whether or not a book is working, even after it's been published. Even well after it's been published, I think you don't know if it is really any good, and I don't know that you can rely on the response of other people necessarily. I mean, I've had friends who have said, "This is a book I was born to write," and I think it hasn't been the book they were born to write. And then, conversely, I've had friends be like, "This didn't totally work," and then it is absolutely extraordinary. So I'm not always sure that the makers are the best judge of their own work. Maybe.
I think that's right. There was one over here.
So in the first part of the book, the title...
Oh, hi.
So sorry.
Thank you.
So in the first part of the book, the title of the play is The Opposite Shore. The second part then introduces the play as Rivers. Did the title change during the drafting process? I'm curious if the direction of the second half required a more ambiguous or flexible name to better reflect the shifting dynamics of the narrative.
Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, so the title of the book of the play. I'm left. So a lot of the titles in the book of the plays and the films. There's a lot of different artworks in the book. Those are all titled. Not all. They're mostly titles that were rejected by my publishers for various books of mine, including.
That's so funny.
Yeah, including The Opposite Shore. I never tried to name anything Rivers. I thought a lot of it was in. I was trying to figure out how and when to reveal the switch in the second half. And I knew that obviously there would be a moment when the character would refer to Xavier definitively as her son. But I didn't actually want that to be at the very, very opening. And that was the one note that both my editor in the US and in the UK had, is that they felt that maybe there should be a more decisive indication of the shift earlier in the first part, but I really didn't want. I wanted to hold
the
back.
second part.
Sorry, in the second part, but I really did want to hold back on that definitive act of naming. So I changed the names of the play to signal that something was off. Just like I didn't need the reader to definitively be like, oh, this is a different reality. But I just wanted to think for them to think, yes, that's not right. And then a page or two later, then it's confirmed that it's definitely not right. Yeah. Thank you.
What do you like best about being a writer, and what do you like least? And also, how would you have answered this question early in your career?
Oh, great question. I love writing. I really do. It's where I feel best. It's where I feel most free. I don't feel particularly free in other aspects of my life necessarily, and I don't think I even always remember to think about freedom as an option. But I do feel, I feel, and I've continued to feel that way over many years. Writing feels to me intensely intimate and private. What do I like least? I think what I am most wary of is the role playing of being a writer in some way, with all the possible vanity that comes with that. I think that's what worries me the most, maybe. I don't think I would have thought that when I was younger. It probably would have seemed to me very important to be able to call myself a writer and to be perceived by others as a writer. That feels less and less important to me, and what feels most important is to retain that kind of sense of freedom and playfulness and the ability to take a risk and the ability, to make catastrophic mistakes in my writing. I won't say who it is, but there's a novelist whose work is phenomenal. I really love this writer, and probably my favorite work of hers is maybe her least successful novel, because as another friend of ours described it, as she built this perfect car, and then she just drove it into a trash can. But that's actually what I love about the book, is that she has this extraordinary technical skill, she has this extraordinary voice and mind, and she built this marvelous thing, and then she had the sense of irreverence just to kind of drive a wrecking ball through it. And that's the kind of spirit in which I want to try to make work. So thank you.
Hi. Yes. So I wanted to know, because I have a theater background, and your depiction of finding a role and all of those things, the references to the actor were so spot on. And I wanted to know if there was a research process, or do you think maybe it's because art somehow all meets in the middle? But I just found it to be really authentic.
Thank you so much for saying that. It's a relief. I think it's both. So when I first moved to New York, I moved to New York in 2008, I think. A lot of my friends were actors and playwrights. In those off Broadway productions, and I went to a lot of theater, but I also had a lot of time, which is the most valuable thing, I think, in any creative practice, is time to waste. I had time to waste, so I would sit in on all their rehearsals. I would talk to them a lot, and I wasn't researching anything actively in any way. I just liked being around that world and around them, and being open to other people's process and other people's way of making work. But I think at the same time, in this book, and certainly in my previous book, which is about simultaneous interpretation, they were both crafts that felt to me very, very close to writing fiction. This idea of channeling voices, the idea of kind of moving language from one place to another place, all of those felt to me opportunities to talk about to talk to myself about what I thought about about writing. So I think it was really a combination of the two things. Thank you.
Another question?
I just wanted to follow up on the theater world of it all. Like, are there any specific plays or like even fiction that has like theater as part of the story that were influential to you? Because it was very authentic as a person with a theater background. Like that really hit home.
Thank you. I mean, in terms of a story about acting, I think Persona, the Bergman film, was a huge influence, I think in very obvious ways, on the book. In terms of actual plays, well, so the character of the playwright is a fictional character completely. But the experience of the play that was in the excerpt that I read, that's Annie Baker's play Aliens, which I saw at the Rattlestick in whatever year, and it completely blew me away. And it was one of those things where I thought, this is something that that'd be so hard to do in a novel. I don't know if people in this room are familiar with that play, but it's extraordinary. Suddenly you're watching this play and nothing is happening, and then somebody's singing "If I Had a Hammer," and everybody's weeping, and you don't understand what's happened, but you've been utterly transformed. And so I was really thinking, when I was trying to imagine like what would be the work that somebody would see and you would want to work with that person instantly, and I thought of that play, which was amazing to me. I mean, another production that was very influential, even though not necessarily in direct ways, but was Declan Dolan did an incredible production of The Cherry Orchard with a Russian cast with his company Cheek by Jowl, and that was, again, just a transformative experience. So they weren't necessarily directly on the page in the same way. But yeah, I have so much, I'm really in awe of what people can do in the space of a theater, and too much in awe to actually put it in my book. So it's notably there's a black hole where the play would be, because I just thought that that's something that I don't actually think can be done in a book. So it shouldn't be in the book at all. Thanks.
Do we have another question? Sure. Let's get you a microphone.
I'm sorry if this is one of those boring craft questions, but I'm curious if the book exists in any other form while you're writing it. Outline, I don't know, scene cards, index cards, little notes to self. I do emails to self sometimes when I have like an idea, and sometimes I write in the voice of the character as an email to myself. I'm very curious if you have anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, David Mitchell has a wonderful thing where if he is stuck in his book, he has his characters write letters to him, and they're mostly complaint letters, I think, which I thought was so...
Resignation.
Yeah, which I thought was so charming, but also the idea that you would have to inhabit the voice of every character, like not just your central character, but the secondary characters as well. I mean, I unfortunately don't do anything that exciting. I outline the entire thing before I start, usually, but that is like a one-page outline. And then not much else happens. I just write it. My husband writes quite comparatively densely plotted novels, and he has like a murder board. There's index cards and color codes, and there's but I don't do that. I'm trying to think. I think for some of my previous novels, I've always had images. But I don't think I did for this one either. Yeah, thanks.
Well, I have one last question. In the section you read us, the narrator definitely questions whether the director of Salvation did the right thing, and whether he was really trespassing ethically in letting this man kind of blunder on stage for what gave the audience what felt like the best performance of his life, but wasn't necessarily a performance. What is your take on that? Because you also said that, in a way, which I think I've heard from a lot of artists, and I kind of believe that what we all want is to write the thing that's better than we are and smarter than we are, which is kind of like saying one wants to be an instrument.
Gosh. You know, when you first asked the first part of the question, I was like, I wouldn't do that myself, is what I thought. Me, myself, I
wouldn't film the guy in his stumbles.
Is what I thought. But then when you said we all want to be an instrument, then I thought, oh, maybe I would. I don't know.
Well, not so much that we want to be the director, but we all kind of want to.
We want to be no, that's exactly. Yeah. It's you don't want to, but that there's a process of submission in making any kind of work. I think where you're open to the will of something else, something other than yourself, and perhaps in the case of something that's deeply collaborative, you're open to the will of other people,
right?
And that's part of the process. And in that sense,
yes,
I think I would want to be used, but not to use. Which is a cop-out, probably, but yeah.
I think it's a good answer. Well, Katie has generously said she will sign her books, and we have some for sale, I think, back there. I hope I can't quite see, but I know we have them for sale somewhere. Okay, right back there in that corner. And to get us all exercise tonight, Katie will be signing way over diagonally in this corner. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.